Hi gang, well the 10th edition of Warhammer 40,000 is here and the galaxy has changed a fair bit over the last few years, so if you're returning to 40k or getting into it for the first time, here's a sort of general lore update. What's been happening in the grim dark future of the 41st and I guess now potentially 42nd millennium. So with a new edition of any game come new players and returning players, and 40k lore is one of those things where it can be difficult to know where to start, and that isn't necessarily made easier by the advancing timeline. In case you didn't know, for most of its existence, Warhammer 40,000 has been mostly a static sandbox setting, the Imperium of Man, permanently always crumbling and on the brink of falling, ravaged by attacks from without by alien Xenos, and from within by the forces of chaos, constantly fighting on thousands of battlefronts that conveniently never actually conclude so that you can fight there too. For the first 30 years of this game, the universe was permanently set right at the end of the 41st millennium, somewhere in the 990s. But since 2017, the setting has started to evolve, with plot lines that combine in-game supplements, new models, campaigns, and Black Library novels, and push this timeline on. And there are loads of them. The new Leviathan rulebook for the 10th edition of Warhammer has done a pretty good job of summarizing all this, but it doesn't cover everything. So in this video, I'm going to try and sum up all the important events of the last few years, the order in which they happened, and also show you where you can read more about them so that you can be up to date and ready to get back into the game. But first, let's set the scene. In the 744th year of the 41st millennium, on the planet of Corinto, the seer Tagarth proclaimed the time of ending, a time of great upheaval for the Imperium where even the light of the Emperor would dim. He was, of course, immediately executed for heresy, as is right and proper, but it turned out that from the mid-700s onwards, his prophecies might have been on the money. Up until this point, the Imperium of Man, the protagonist of Warhammer 40k, had been a stubbornly unchanging force for almost 10,000 years. It had originally been formed by the Emperor of Man on Terra in the late 31st millennium, at the end of a 5,000-year-long period of isolation and turmoil known as the Age of Strife, during which mankind's previous star-faring civilizations had been destroyed and interstellar travel rendered impossible due to great warp storms. But when the ill discipline of the Eldari race caused the birth of the fourth chaos power, Slaanesh, the warp storms were cleared away. The Eldari were fractured, split between the Asuryani on their isolated craft worlds, and the Drukhari in their dark city of Camorra in the Webway, and the Emperor planned to fill that vacuum. For over 200 years, the Imperium fought its great crusade to unite humanity and purge Xenos from the galaxy, led by the Emperor's creations, the 18 Primarchs and their Space Marine legions, while the Emperor attempted to build Imperial roots into the ancient Eldar webway. But the forces of chaos managed to corrupt half the Primarchs who, along with their legions, turned traitor in the war known as the HORUS heresy. The result of the heresy was the death of the Primarch Horus, its leader, and the defeat of the traitors and their banishment into the Eye of Terror, but the Emperor was mortally wounded and placed on the Golden Throne, reduced to maintaining the light of the Astronomicon, the great beacon used for Imperial warp navigation, and to holding shut the gates of this broken webway project, lest Terra be flooded with demons from beyond. And without his guidance, from the ashes of this Horus heresy, a new Imperium emerged. The most powerful faction in the galaxy, the Imperium officially rules over all of humanity, over millions of systems scattered across thousands of light years. But without the Emperor and the Primarchs at its head, over time it turned from a dynamic force to a ponderous, bureaucratic, and staunchly conservative one. The vast majority of humanity, if they're not stationed to an active warfront, are crushed under the yoke of ridiculous industrial tithes, horrifically unequal societies, brutally repressive laws, or just the endless weight of bureaucracy, all enforced by the Imperium's state religion, the worship of their god emperor, which rose in the 32nd millennium and demanded obeisance from all humanity lest they be labelled heretics. Even technology is no saviour. The keepers of scientific knowledge, the Adeptus Mechanicus, consider technology to be sacred ancient knowledge and treat scientific advancement as heresy, As the foreword of almost every book says, to be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim, dark future there is only war. So that's the Imperium, and as the 10,000 years since the heresy and 40k passed, the Imperium was crumbling. It was frequently riven by internal political struggles, attempted coups, and differences in doctrine. It was harassed at every turn by the forces of the Xenos, from constant manipulation by Eldari craft worlds to something like the War of the Beast in M32, where Orc forces invaded Terra, only eventually stopped during the second invasion of Ullanor, a world originally invaded and cleansed by Orcs by the Emperor and Horus back in the Great Crusade, but things got worse. Anyway, while these alien wars continued, the Imperium was also assaulted by the forces of Chaos, in particular the 12 Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler, who had forged the remnants of those traitor legions into a new Black Legion in the depths of the Eye of Terror, and was slowly leading raids and assaults out from the Eye in order to collect the artifacts he needed for his long war against the Imperium. The Imperium itself lurched from conflict to conflict, crisis to crisis, throwing untold numbers of soldiers and war machinery at every enemy it could find, obsessed with not only its survival, but still holding on to its manifest destiny to rule the galaxy in the name of its God Emperor. It's a pretty bleak place. But as Tagarth said, in the latter years of the 41st millennium, it was about to get a lot bleaker. The first sign of this was the rise of new enemies. In the 700s M41, the Silent King, the leader of the Necrons, returned to the galaxy. The Necrons were unknown to humanity, but they were well known to the Eldar, who had fought against them in the War in Heaven millions of years before, when the ancient Necrons laid waste to the galaxy as they attempted to defeat their enemies, the Old Ones. At the conclusion of the war, the Old Ones had disappeared, and the Necrons became dormant in great tomb worlds, waiting for the galaxy to repopulate, leaving it to the Eldari, but the Silent King, on a self-imposed exile, had seen what waited in the void between galaxies and had returned, secretly working to speed up the slow waking of the Necron dynasties. At the same time, in 742 M41, the Imperium recorded its first contact with the advanced and dynamic Tau Empire, then undertaking its second sphere of expansion, and fought the Damocles Gulf Crusade to try and halt their spread. Some of the Tau forces were split. The discovery of the Dawnblade on Arthas Moloch led to the creation of the independent Farsight enclaves, but the Imperial forces were thinly stretched. Eventually, the Gulf was abandoned to the growing Tau Empire because another Xenos threat was on the horizon, and it was the same one that the Silent King had seen decades before. The first invasion of the Tyranids, known as Behemoth, began in 745 M41 and pulled all local forces into a last-ditch attempt to stop the invasion on the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge. Over the next 200 years, these three new Xenos threats became more and more apparent. Behemoth was defeated, but splinter fleets of Tyranids continued to ravage the galactic east. The Tau fortified their second sphere and fought a near-constant war against Imperial forces. And in 897, when Sanctuary 101 was overrun by mysterious metallic invaders, the Imperium was finally forced to take the Necron threat seriously. And of course, the old enemies of the Imperium weren't idle through this. The usual battles continued. Imperial worlds falling to corruption by the forces of chaos, like during the Siege of Vrax in 813, or falling to the inefficiency of the Imperium itself, as with the BADAB War of 901. And the old enemies were still there. The Orcs, under the war boss Gazakul Mag Uruk Thraka, invaded their ancient home of Ullanor again in 941, though by now it had been renamed Armageddon. The Second War for Armageddon consumed huge numbers of forces as the Black Templars chapter and the Armageddon Steel Legion, led by Commissar Yarrick, fought back the Orc invasion. And all this unrelenting warfare would ramp up again in the final decade of the 41st millennium. In 993 M41, with the Imperium embattled as never before, the second Tyranid invasion came in the form of Hive Fleet Kraken, precipitated by Genestealer occult uprisings on Icar 4, and eventually consuming systems across the galactic east and decimating the population of the Eldar craft world Iyanden. In 997 M41, Gargakul's orcs invaded first Piscina 5 and then Golgotha, while in the east, the Tau launched their third sphere of expansion under the inspirational leadership of Commander Shadowsun, and war erupted again across the Damocles Gulf. This is told in the Warzone Damocles campaign, and this spread out into smaller conflicts like the Taros campaign. And then in 998, Gargakul invaded Armageddon again, and as the third war for Armageddon sucked in military resources again from light years around, a different orc invasion known as the Red War rampaged through the Sanctus Reach, dealt with in the Sanctus Reach campaign series. The Imperium was on its knees in many places, struggling to keep up with all these Xenos invasions, and the final year wasn't going to be any easier. As retold in the Warzone Fenris campaign, in 999 M41, the traitor Primarch Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, banished to the warp 10,000 years before, returned, invading Fenris, the homeworld of his old rivals, the Space Wolves. Warned by the return of the mysterious 13th Company and aided by the Dark Angels and the Grey Knights, the Space Wolves managed to defeat the invasion, but not before Magnus succeeded in conducting a great ritual. He moved the Planet of the Sorcerers, his legion's base in the Eye of Terror, into real space, into the same system as his ancient homeworld of Prospero, giving the Thousand Suns Legion a dedicated base in the Imperium for the first time in 10,000 years. And by the time this happened, the other side of the Imperium was embroiled in the biggest Tyranid invasion yet, as Hive Fleet Leviathan moved inwards from below the galactic plane, and strange things were starting to happen all across the galaxy. The Great Awakening saw a ripple of uncontrollable psychic energy manifest in humans, and the light of the Astronomicon, for the very first time, visibly dimmed. So well done, Tagarath. You were right. Anyway, after all that, well then, our new advancing plotline begins with the Gathering Storm series. At some point at the turn of the millennium, the 13th Black Crusade began. Abaddon, War Master of Chaos, led an armada against the fortress world of Cadia, destroying the mysterious black stone pylons there. The Mechanicus Tech Major Belisarius Cawl, diverted from his mission to Ultramar, finally discovered that it was this black stone, which the Imperium knew mostly as a weird rock used in ancient Xenos technology, that held back the Eye of Terror. When the despoiler crashed an ancient Blackstone Fortress space station into Cadia, destroying the planet, the Eye of Terror spread into a great rift of warp and real space overlap that slowly grew to split the galaxy in two. The spread of the Great Rift had colossal effects. Its first and most unsettling was the Noctis Aeterna, the blackness. Warp travel once again became impossible, and the planets of the Imperium were isolated from each other as waves of demonic incursions spread across the galaxy. Terra itself was attacked by a horde of Khorne demons during the Second Siege of Terra, and the Adeptus Custodes sallied out for the first time in thousands of years during the Battle of Lion's Gate, as told in the Watchers of the Throne novel series. In the east, the Tau Empire's fourth sphere expansion went horrifically wrong as their new faster-than-light drives, which used backwards engineered Imperial technology, suddenly dropped their fleet into the turbulent warp space of the Rift. The surviving Tau emerged into the Chalnath expanse traumatized, having massacred all their non-Tau auxiliaries in the wake of what they witnessed in the warp. But despite the effects of the spreading rift, some survivors of Cadia did manage to escape the system, with help from a new Xenos power. Across the craft worlds of the Eldar, the Inari arose. Led by the former aspect warrior turned witch, Ivrain, this new cult attempted the early awakening of the Eldar god of the dead, Inyad, in order to save the Eldari race. Originally manifesting in the Drakari city of Komorra, the Inari had travelled to many of the ancient Eldar craft worlds, gaining new followers at every turn, though often battling against the demonic legions of their ancient enemy Slanesh as they went. In fact, the craft world Biel Tan was broken apart during one such invasion. For whatever reason, Ivrain's path led her to the Cadian system just as the survivors, led by the Imperial Saint Celestine and Archmagos Cawl, attempted their escape. And the Inari spirited them through the webway to Cawl's original destination, Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines. There, as chaos forces from the spread of the Great Rift attacked the system, Cawl revealed his cargo, a suit of armour that, with the help of Ivrain, succeeded in returning the Primarch of the Ultramarines, Robuta Guilliman, to life. After an extended and fraught voyage through the warp storms and the webway, aided by the Eldari Harlequins and the mysterious fallen angel Cypher, Guilliman arrived in the solar system just after the Battle of Lion's Gate, and a new age began. And we should say now that all dates after this are a little bit circumspect, as one of the things Guilliman noticed immediately is that the Imperium doesn't actually know what date it is. I'll continue counting forwards from M42, but this could all actually be 1,000 years earlier. Who knows? By this point, the rift had spread almost across the whole galaxy, and Guilliman took swift action. He retasked the Adeptus Custodes with a wider remit and reformed the ancient Sisters of Silence, lost since the Heresy, and then he launched the Indomitus Crusade, with the intention of shoring up the defences this side of the rift, a region called Imperium Sanctus, and helping where he could on the abandoned far side of the rift, called Imperium Nihilus. He did this with the help of thousands of Primaris Space Marines, an upgrade to the Space Marine template that Guilliman had tasked Call with 10,000 years before. The new Indomitus fleet spread out across the galaxy, fighting wars against the various Chaos and Xenos forces who had taken advantage of the rift, and spreading the technology required to create the Primaris Marines across the Imperium, all detailed in the Dawn of Fire series. And Guilliman himself fighting the Plague Wars against the Death Guard around 012 M42, maybe, as they and their Primarch Mortarion attempted to invade Ultramar. That's detailed in the Dark Imperium series. And then also coming to the aid of the Blood Angels to defeat what they thought were the final tendrils of Leviathan. As the Noctis Eterna receded, a wave of psychic power spread across the galaxy due to the presence of the Rift, detailed in the Psychic Awakening campaign. Manifestations of faith seemed more potent in forces like the Sisters of Battle. Orc Wars, led by engorged weird boys, rampaged across sectors, and the Pariah Nexus was discovered, a sector-wide attempt to just avoid all of that by the Necrons. Another new player entered the galactic stage as the ancient Leagues of Votan, descendants of some of the very first human colonists, were seen more and more. The Squats had always been present in the galaxy, but had mostly confined themselves to the galactic core. The increased warp storms had forced their prospector fleets out into the wider galaxy in greater and greater numbers, as they sought planets rich in resources to exploit. As the Indomitus Crusade continued, much of its focus came to rest on the system of Vigilus, detailed in the Vigilus campaign books. The system was the gateway to an area called the Nakmund Gauntlet, one of the only stable routes through the rift. Both the Imperium and the War Master poured forces into the conflict on Vigilus in an attempt to control the valuable corridor, but while this battle raged on, Abaddon was presented with a new opportunity to attack the Imperium, this time in the form of the Arcs of Omen. He entered into an alliance with the demonic being Vashtor the Archiphane, Lord of the Soul Forges, who was trying to locate an ancient superweapon created by powerful aliens long ago and then locked in a forgotten vault. In order to do this, he needed to assemble a key, and that key was to be formed of 3 mysterious artifacts present in the galaxy. There were loads of potential leads to these artifacts, so together they pulled Space Hulks from the warp and gifted them to Chaos warbands with instructions to follow a lead and search for the artifact. These Arcs of Omen popped up all over the galaxy while the war on Vigilus was still raging, as conveniently detailed in the Arcs of Omen series. Eventually, with aid from Angron, Demon Primarch of the World Eaters, and occasionally foiled by Be'lakor, the first Demon Prince, Vashtor succeeded in gathering the 3 main key fragments, the Ouroboros, the Tukulka engine, and the Plague Heart, above the ruins of the ancient Dark Angel's homeworld of Caliban. He was opposed by the Dark Angels and Blood Angels chapters, but even though they were led by the mysteriously returned Primarch of the Dark Angels, Lion L. Johnson, they couldn't stop Vashtor from uniting the fragments, and this planet-sized key turned out to be an ancient constructor device for the webway itself, and escaped by burrowing through the dimensions. And then finally, with the Imperium split in 2, with 2 loyal Primarchs returned, though currently on opposite sides of the galaxy, with Chaos in possession of a weapon of absurd power, and with the Indomitus Crusade continuing, the Tyranids returned. Leviathan hadn't been defeated, and 3 new tendrils had appeared, closing from the top and bottom of the galactic plane like a set of jaws aimed directly for terror. The Lord Commander Solar Leontus directed colossal troop movements as the Astra Militarum fortified anchor worlds across the galactic southwest, and the Custodian General Trajan Valoris led elite soul blades into the dark to slow the Hive fleets. But while the initial assault was withstood at Bastior, even bigger, moon-sized Tyranid bioforms were sighted in the void, and the swarm kept coming. And that's where we are. I think I've covered everything big. I mean, there's loads more happening across the galaxy, but if you want the big picture, yeah, that's kind of it. It's a lot, right? And that's because all this background is intended to give you loads and loads of material for your games of Warhammer, from leading boarding assaults in an attempt to disable Abaddon's Arcs of Omen, to lining up your Astra Militarum for a grim last stand as Hive Fleet Leviathan assaults another anchor world, to preparing your kinfolk for a resource-gathering expedition after their ancient homeworld was consumed by the Great Rift. It's huge and messy, and it's always been huge and messy because it's meant to be a ton of story threads that you can grab onto. As I record this, the focus is on the renewed assault of Hive Fleet Leviathan, and the Leviathan book does a great job of summarising all the above, but I'll link all the reading material I've mentioned below if anything stands out to you and if you want to read further. Whatever battlefield you pick, good luck, and thanks for watching. If you'd like more lore from the universe of Warhammer, then like, subscribe, and comment below. And if you'd like to support the channel, and I guess me, then you can order your toy soldiers through the affiliate links below, or join the Patreon, where you get to vote on upcoming videos, see videos earlier than everyone else, and of course, join in the discussion on our Discord server. See ya!